Even if you remove that mandate, I don't think there's a world where hospitals will say, we're not going to provide interpretation services.
Hey everyone, and welcome to a rare emergency podcast, news-driven podcast here from Slater Pod about the order by the Trump administration, which is designating English as the official language of the United States that came out on March 1st. So today in the podcast, we have three experts. So we have Peter Argondizo from Argo Translation, the CEO. We have Deepak Patel, CEO of Globo, the interpreting tech company. And then we have our very own Rocio Chavarriaga, Senior Research Analyst and Editor at Slater, who is also helping us provide context here. So hi, Rocio, Deepak, and Peter.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having us,
Hi,
Florian.
everyone.
Maybe just very briefly, Peter and Deepak, just give us a very short introduction, where you're based, just short introduction about the company before we get started with discussing this executive order by President Trump. So first, Peter.
Great. My name is Peter Argondizo. I'm the CEO and one of the founders here at Argo Translation. This is really awesome because this week is our 30th anniversary, and nothing says happy anniversary like crazy change, so that's good. Previous to founding Argo, I was a project manager at a medical device manufacturer in Milwaukee, where I'm originally from, and now I'm in the Chicago area. So thanks for having us, Florian. We focus, by the way, on written translation. We do all sorts of stuff. SharePoint, content management systems, you name it, all that sort of thing.
Thanks, Florian, for also inviting me. Deepak Patel, CEO at Global Language Solutions. We are a full-service language services company, meaning we provide on-site telephone, video interpretation, dabbling with AI, as well as translation. We primarily focus on healthcare, and we've been around for over 15 years. Myself, I've always been in healthcare for the past 25 plus years, working with not just hospital systems, but also insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. And I am based an hour outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
Thanks. And Rocio, maybe a few words from you as well, where you're based.
I'm currently based in Malaga, Spain, and my background is in everything that has to do with language services, from operational aspects of it. That's mainly what I did on the LSP and the buyer side. And I'm also an adjunct professor at a university where I teach translation and interpreting. And as later, I'm an analyst. And I also work in some special research projects and consulting for the company.
All right, so let's get this started. Deepak, when you saw the executive order, what's now 3 days ago, what was your initial reaction?
More news that has happened in the last month than I can imagine. I want to dig deep because the first headline was obviously Trump signing an EO to make English the national language. And my first reaction was, I actually didn't think it was that big of a deal. We have 30 states that already claim English to be the official language. Some states have more than just English. But then, when I read a little bit deeper, his EO also talked about rescinding Clinton's EO, which is all about providing more clarity to the Civil Rights Act, making sure that language access was under the umbrella of discrimination, as well as making sure that all federal agencies provided language services had a language plan, as well as any sort of entities that receive federal funding. So when I read that part of the order, then I started to think more and more in terms of the implications, which I know we'll talk more about.
This was a bit of a movement the last time he was in office. I think they were trying to get this done, and I think he was dissuaded the last time around. And it just seemed like it was sort of on the heels of an already crazy day out of Washington. So, I guess it's part of that sort of that nationalistic sort of feeling, if you will, to name it. At first, much like Deepak, I didn't think much about it. But then when I dug a little bit deeper, and you start to dig a little bit deeper, and I know we're going to cover all those things today, but yeah, it was a little bit of shock. I mean, my colleagues and the ALC group that I'm in, a lot of just confusion, panic, you name it. So yeah, it's just part of the craziness.
Did you learn about it like from a WhatsApp group or on X, or where did you see it first?
There's an ALC group on WhatsApp, and I started to see the chat just blow up, and I was like, oh gosh, now what's going on? And
Okay.
there was some very colorful language in there, which is good. That's great.
let's give some of the listeners here that are not based in the U.S. Some historical background maybe about the language in the U.S. Like how and why was there no national language? I mean, for example, here in Switzerland, we got 3 national languages, and then I'm not even sure the fourth one has like another kind of official label. So in Europe, very proud about like labeling languages very kind of accurately. What status do they have? There's like layers there. So in the US, there just historically has been no national language at all. Anybody wants to comment on this? Maybe Deepak?
I got this question from a good friend who's over in Europe, and I had to think about it, and a couple of thoughts. One is, the U.S. prides itself on individual freedom, right? Be who you want, believe who you want, think what you want. The other thing is, if you think about when we were founded, independence, there was multiple languages being spoken. It wasn't just English. It's not like when the U.S. was founded, we only spoke English. There was multiple languages that the population was speaking. And then the third one, just, I'm first generation. We've been a country of immigrants, welcoming people come in, no matter what they speak, no matter what they believe. And I think for all those reasons, there was never a thought that we needed to have a national language. We all embrace the fact that people come here, speak different languages, and that's a wonderful thing. That's my take. I haven't been in the heads of the past administrations to wonder why they didn't do such a thing. I think one can guess in terms of the theme with some of the things this current administration has been doing. But that's my take in terms of why there hasn't been a national language in the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree. I think past administrations have stopped short because I think there were some worries of, alienating our immigrant population. And this is a nation of immigrants, essentially. I'm first generation as well. My folks came over from Italy, and, we spoke Italian at home, but we my folks wanted us to 100 miles an hour ahead with English. That was, and I think for most people, it is the de facto language, I guess. There's no accommodation for it in the Constitution. So it's really kind of a nothing burger on the surface of it, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Rosia, you said there's nothing in the Constitution. So this is an executive order. And then, so Rosia, for the non-US listeners, what is an executive order? And so this is not the Constitution. And what's the level here?
Yeah, but before I give that definition, is actually a comment on Peter's take on this, which he mentioned the languages that were already there, and there's nothing in the Constitution, yes, specifically, because we can't forget that there were First Nations in the United States. And so Native American languages like Navajo today, for instance, there are entire communities where that's the official language, no English. And Deepak did also make the point that some states also have their own official languages. So we have nations within the nation that are free to speak whatever languages they use. So that's very important, and I believe, and a lot of people actually have said this, that this was left out of the Constitution on purpose, so that people would have that freedom. Now, about what an executive order is, and I have to disclaim that I'm not a legal expert, I'm just somebody who has been in this journey from the start. A ruling that is issued by the president of a country, in this case the United States, directing an executive branch of the government, like the Department of Justice, to implement it. In this case, this executive order actually has language that directs the Attorney General to provide new guidance as the original Clinton executive order was rescinded.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about the kind of the history of language access. Now we've heard from Deepak also the Clinton order that built on the Civil Rights Act. So how long has the term language access been around? What's the history there? And what would be the implications going forward, Rosia?
Although I cannot speak of a precise moment when language access became a term per se, it really started appearing in legislative documentation, both federal and state documentation, in the late 1990s. And that's when we actually started working on standards beyond the courts, because at the time we only had a truly organized court interpreting system, but nothing more. And after that, a lot of groups like the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare. There's one, the IMIA, and many more actually started working on the medical side. So language access became a term of the government, truly official, I would say, in that Clinton Executive Order 13166.
So, Peter, is that something you still remember? Is that something that when the company was started? So maybe you can shed a bit of color on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, from that era, right? I mean, we had legislation that impacted our industry in a huge way, right? If we think of the EU, right? The formally saying that, hey, anything that ships to the EU has to be translated. Some of that stuff was missing from the U.S. And I think Clinton's order was really the tipping point. We actually had a client in that era sue that was being sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So a client walked in to an office and requested information in Korean and was kind of rebuked, was mistreated, if you will, and under the Americans with Disabilities Act brought a suit against the company. So I think that's an important point that I hope we discuss as well, that there's multiple paths here, whether it's civil rights or Americans with disabilities. I think I saw something in show notes about due process as well. There's multiple paths here. So I think it's not for the Trump administration to completely say, hey, there's not going to be any language access provided under federal or state guidelines is going to be very, very difficult. Because I think for me, a lot of the issue is we can say what we want, right? You can go outside in a thunderstorm and say, no, it's sunny. Well, you can say that, but you're still going to get wet, right? There's the reality of it is whether you're talking about a school administration, whether you're talking about a courthouse, you're going to be faced with either parents, people are going through the criminal system, wherever it might be, in an office that don't speak English, and you're going to have to figure out how to accommodate them.
I wasn't surprised when I saw, if you think about what Trump ran on and some of the big issues that was really important to the population of the United States, immigration was one in terms of just, influx of immigrants and immigrants that maybe were creating crimes, and just immigration as a whole was a topic. And then you have another topic which they addressed, which was DEI, in terms of how much effort and are we putting into diversity, inclusion, and equity. And this is sort of like something that addresses both of it in a weird way, right? The fact that we're going to make English the national language. We're not going to provide services to folks that don't speak English. I think at a macro level, that's how you could view it. I think, though, if you get to the next level in terms of the implications, some of the things that Peter is saying, it doesn't make sense in terms of just the impact of all this. So if you think about healthcare and hospital systems, yes, hospitals and providers are mandated to provide language services, through 1557. Even if you remove that mandate, I don't think there's a world where hospitals will say, we're not going to provide interpretation services. If you spoke to a doctor, I don't think a doctor would say, I only do this because I have to. They do it because they recognize how important it is to be able to communicate and understand what people are thinking, what people are feeling. And that benefits everyone. It makes the most time of not just the patient, it makes the most time of that physician. Instead of having to spend 40 minutes trying to understand what's going on, they only have to spend 15 minutes. Instead of that patient spending maybe, an hour and a half in the ER, they're only spending 20 minutes in the ER, which frees up capacity. And so I think that's the level of thinking we need to have around this, which I don't think the administration has necessarily thought through yet.
This was on my list for things that would speak to this, basically the status quo, just continuing, like basically that is just generally good for business or for a hospital system or for just kind of efficient operations to service that population, 20, 30, 40 billion people of limited English proficiency in the US, right? So that's almost a business case. And then you have things like state level language access laws. There's like the Sixth Amendment for criminal cases. And other things. So maybe Peter, can you comment on that? Like other areas where like this executive order can kind of override or just has no kind of bearing or impact?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the school systems, I think it's going to be really important because remember, the school systems are, while they do in some cases receive federal funding that's usually very regional or locally funded through the property tax base. So, I think local school districts are definitely going to continue doing business as usual. I think the issue becomes, we were talking about, does this change the vibe? Does this change sort of like, well, does it set precedents in some way? If the federal government doesn't have to do something, then does that follow that at the state level, at the local level, there's no requirement to do something? And I think that could be potentially dangerous. I think another thing, maybe that might be interesting to consider is that idea of funding, right? If some of these federal agencies are being cut anyway, in many ways, or reduced, staff reduced, I was actually thinking, language services might be even more necessary because maybe there were some internal people that were doing some of that work. So I think it's really going to be kind of a wait and see sort of thing. It's like, what happens with this? As with a lot of these things, like you say, I don't think it was very well thought out, and what are the consequences and what's going to happen? Because again, it's still going to be raining outside, right? The needs are still there.
So do you think that there's this kind of paragraph in the order that says, I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but basically it says, nothing in this order requires or directs any change in the services provided by any agencies. It also says agency heads are not required to amend, remove, or otherwise stop production of documents, products, or services prepared or offered in languages other than English. So this seems to be a bit of a hedge. They like say, all right, like we're mandating that U.S. English is the national language, but like you guys just keep doing what you're doing. We're not actually kind of micromanaging into what you are really doing at the moment. I'm not sure, Deepak, you have any thoughts on that?
I think they also recognize, right, the Civil Rights Act and 1557, these are laws. You can't issue an EO and overwrite laws. So I think they understand that. I think where it's going to come down to is the enforcement of the laws from the federal government. Are they going to make the effort to actually enforce this? And this is where, and Peter raised a really good point, it's not just the EO, it's also funding. So if you think about some of these federal agencies that do use language services, yes, so now you might have the federal government not enforcing them to use it, but at the same time, the federal government's going to be cutting their budget to not use it, right? And so I think that's an important point. But it's all going to be about enforcement. And again, I think you have to look at each of the different sectors to get a sense of, do they just already understand how important this is? So whether or not the federal government's going to enforce it, it makes zero sense for us not to do this. Now, the funding, though, is critical, because if you have less funding, then you have to figure out, how do I do it in a more cost-efficient way?
And how would that impact you? I mean, you're in the healthcare space, which is probably where it's super critical to have language access. I mean, you wouldn't want to, this is one of the sectors you don't want to cut, right? Generally.
You don't, but there's most likely going to be cuts to Medicaid and a lot of funding for hospital systems. And a lot of hospital systems are already facing financial pressures as it is. So from a hospital standpoint, there's going to have to be a lot of thinking, how do we deliver these services in the most cost-effective way? I'll say something kind of controversial here, because I'm relatively new to language services. I've only been in it for 4 years, even though from a personal standpoint, it's impacted my family for over a decade through family members needing interpretation services and translation services. Language services as an industry has grown. It's grown year after year after year because of the increase in demand, as well as the increased recognition how important and vital it is to do it. I think there has been opportunity to be more innovative with how we deliver language services. The analog I like to give is, you guys been following AI and the DeepSeek model out of China, where, it was said that no one could create an AI model as good as the US. And then here we go, a company out of China was basically able to create something without the same hardware power and more restraints. And there's something to be said about when you are faced in a situation where you have a lot of constraints, to be able to think outside the box and be more innovative. So, language services has survived a lot of different things throughout the years as I read about history. This, to me, is just another opportunity to try and figure out, how do we reinvent the wheel here to get through some of this noise over the next, 3 or 4 years.
For me, it just sort of adds to the headwinds that we're already facing, right? I mean, I think AI, like Deepak mentioned, I think it's an opportunity and a threat. We talk about, you could probably do a whole nother show on tariffs and what that does to international trade. because on the corporate side, I think that's going to have impact. And the other thing is, you sort of mentioned sort of the lack of clarity in the EO. And I think overall, if you look at a huge amount of executive orders and change, what that does in the corporate world, at least, is create uncertainty. And with uncertainty, you get PO hesitancy. And where have we seen that? 2008 financial crisis, typically in election cycles. But I think overarching, I do think there is an opportunity. I think, if we go back to, Trados 1 and translation memory and the advent of translation memory, there were a lot of translators, oh God, I'm done. This is terrible, and we're seeing similar things with AI. And for me, I think AI and, machine translation and AI enhanced tools, I consider them to be a gateway drug. I think there are a lot of corporations that haven't touched translation or interpretation and now suddenly will and get some engagement. I do think that the industry will continue to grow. And I do think maybe this is a road bump. And in spite of this, I do think that our industry will continue to grow as well. But it's definitely another headwind.
I want to build on one thing. Sorry, Peter had said, I think earlier, what is the for-profit space going to do, right? Where they aren't under necessarily if they're not receiving funding or it's non-healthcare. And, I always remind people, and you all know this, 20% of the population chooses to speak a language other than English at home when they're at the dinner table. And that's a large portion of our population. And, I do think there's going to be for-profit entities out here that are going to swim against the tide, saying this is actually an opportunity to differentiate ourselves and cater to this population and do more for this population because they're so important. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't think everyone's going to follow suit to what the federal government is. I think people are going to view this as an opportunity to differentiate themselves.
Deepak, do you think in interpreting particularly, this will kind of nudge it a little more towards use of AI or openness for AI, or do you think it kind of the two are not really connected per se? Like, okay, here we have, this particular order, it creates a certain vibe out there, and okay, let's maybe try to reduce costs a little bit in this particular field by adding AI.
I think it's going to do two things, and I'll do this under the lens of healthcare because, we focus on healthcare. One is I think there's going to have to be a lot more energy that we all put in terms of the actual benefit and the return on investment for language services, right? By providing interpretation, translation services, what does it mean to the bottom line or top line? There's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done in healthcare. There's been studies, but those studies are old. Whenever I talk to a hospital system and I tell them, tell me the impact that we made on your patients, the patients that received interpretation services versus the patients that don't, they're not able to really, articulate that. Until you do that, language services will be viewed as almost like a commodity, right? Until you can actually tie it to and this is just healthcare. That's number one. Number two is yes, there will be more, I'll say, innovation. Whether it goes straight to AI, I'm not sure. Right, there's still innovation in terms of being able to do some, not all, some on-site interpretation using telephone and video. Right, there's probably a little bit more in that area. And then yes, I do think there's a portion of interpretation that you can use AI for, the less complicated ones. But I wouldn't say all the innovation is going to happen around AI. I think there's certain things we do today that we probably can do more of.
Peter, I want to get back to you in a second. I just want to ask Rosie a question about enforcement and maybe go a little bit back to the regulatory environment we spoke at the beginning. So this order 13166, right? That was a Clinton order about basically further clarifying what the Civil Rights Act meant in practice for language access, right? So now we're basically, that was rescinded now by Trump, and now we're going back to an environment where enforcement could be lax. Can you just comment a little bit on maybe how it was before? What was the impact once this came out, and what do you see kind of immediately as an impact from this?
13166, what it did is it formalized the provision of language access. At a federal level, it implied that any institution in any field, education, healthcare, you name it, emergency services, anybody who received these funds would actually need to implement formal programs to actually enforce Title VI. So to prevent discrimination and also to promote inclusion. So all of that is in there. And it required formal guidelines. And those were formulated at the time and evolved over time. Like there was an amendment done in 2003, for instance, and so on. And then under President Obama, there were also more guidelines promulgated, let's say, about language access. So the enforcement part comes with the fact that under all of that is actual legislation in that executive order, which was effective up until last Friday or Saturday, everybody needed to comply because most of those institutions I named received federal funds. So the enforcement part, where I personally think that is there's a risk, is that if you are not obligated to comply with these particular executive order that created the programs and the formalization to comply with the law, how are you going to enforce it?
Good point. Let's move to one couple last questions I want to end on. So I know we don't have any constitutional lawyers on this podcast right now, but what's with this executive orders? Like, why can't you just do this via a law? Like, is it just too complicated to put this through Congress, or it's just not important enough, or like, yeah.
Have you ever seen us try and pass a law, Florian?
It's a bill.
It's a bill, yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
That was a deep reference, Florian. That Schoolhouse Rock. That's amazing.
That was really good. Yeah, it feels like every administration is trying to one up the previous one in the number of EOs they're trying to sign. And how much of this is just, I want to try and get as much done as possible initially, understanding it might not all be implemented. How much of this is I want to put out as much as possible to distract from other things going on. I think at the end of the day, again, an EO cannot change a law, and 1557 is law. They made it mandatory, enforceable, right, to provide interpretation services, at least in healthcare settings. And then you go back to the Civil Rights Act, which is even broader than healthcare. These are actual laws. And one of the things I think we've all learned is, and businesses have learned, you don't want to completely change your business based on one administration, because that administration could only be there for 4 years, right? And so you have to think about the long term. In the long term, the law is still the law. Whether it's going to be enforced or not over the next 2 or 4 years, we'll see. And remember, and by the way, enforcement is not just from the federal side. It's people, right? I mean, you legally deserve interpretation services if you ask for it. So that's still there. So it doesn't mean that there won't be enforcement also from the people side. So I think for all those reasons, plus they probably don't prioritize this, I'd imagine, administration in terms of all the laws they want to pass. I think there's bigger things they want to tackle versus, mandating language services. So I think for those reasons, that's why they're not pushing to try and go through the act of making this a law.
Peter, when from the outside, like from Europe, when you look at this, you somehow feel that this is more relevant for the interpreting world. How do you see it for the translation, the written world? Like, do you feel this impact will be similar or less, or?
I mean, it'll be interesting, right? I have a colleague of mine that does a lot with voting access. He does a fair amount of translation in that world, and I would be curious to see at the federal level. At the state level, I don't think it's going to change things, especially the states that are more forward with language services and access to its constituents. But at the federal level, I mean, it's interesting because I received an RFP request from the Veterans Administration on Tuesday of last week. Just saying, hey, can you do this? Can you comply? And then we'll send out the RFP next week. I'm sort of doubting we're going to get that RFP this week. I don't think that's going to happen. So, I would say there's probably more impact on interpretation only because it's more visible. It's more forward. It's more forward facing. People see it. But yeah, I would imagine the document side. You think of the mailings we get here in the U.S., whether it's for voting or whether it's for your taxes or tax notices or on the site. I mean, we've also seen deep degradation of resources. This has been big in the LC group that we've been talking about, lep.gov and some of the other sites that have been just destroyed. They're not there anymore. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the written word, whether it's, for digital distribution or print through mailings. A big question mark, Florian, but good question.
That was it for this emergency episode. I think it was super fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time on such a short notice. And thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.